Step away from the register now. We need to speak with you about your employment authorization.
I work here. I've worked here for 6 years. What is this about?
Are you a United States citizen?
Yes, I was born in Minnesota. Why are you asking me this here in front of customers?
I need to see documentation proving your citizenship and legal right to work. You need to come with us.
This is harassment.
The Tuesday afternoon was quiet at the department store when two men wearing vests with large ice letters entered through the front doors and walked directly to the checkout counter, where Aaliyah Johnson was processing a customer's payment. She had worked at that store for 3 years, a model employee known for her work ethic and her warm smile that made regular customers ask specifically for her. But at that moment, as these two federal agents approached with hard expressions and aggressive posture, Aaliyah's smile disappeared as cold fear settled in her stomach. She was 28 years old, born and raised in Minneapolis, Minnesota, an American citizen who had never had any trouble with the law. But the agents weren't there to verify credentials or ask polite questions. What happened in the next 40 minutes was captured in high definition by the store's security cameras, footage that would become central evidence in one of the most significant civil rights lawsuits involving EICE misconduct in recent history. The agents accused Aaliyah of working illegally, demanded to see her immigration documents in front of shocked customers and horrified coworkers, and when she tried to explain she was an American citizen, they handcuffed her and attempted to remove her from the store while she screamed they were making a mistake. The detention was based on nothing but the color of her skin and assumptions about her last name, an example so flagrant of racial profiling that even witnesses who might normally give officers the benefit of the doubt were outraged. Before we dive into this story that will leave you furious and then hopeful about justice, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button, because what happened when this innocent woman fought back against federal agents who thought they could just grab any black person without consequences is a story that needs to be told. This case exposed not just two problematic agents, but an entire system of immigration enforcement that routinely violates the rights of American citizens based on nothing but appearance. The two ICE agents were veterans of the agency with years of experience conducting enforcement operations. The older one, a man named Robert Chen, had 15 years with ICE and a history of aggressive operations that had generated complaints but never significant consequences. His partner, Michael Torres, had 8 years with the agency and had learned tactics from the more experienced agent. They had been patrolling that shopping area for weeks as part of a targeted operation, supposedly looking for undocumented immigrants working illegally. But internal documents that would later come to light through legal discovery would reveal their targeted operation was little more than systematized racial profiling, a license to stop and question any person of color working service jobs based on no actual evidence of immigration violation. Aaliyah was in the middle of processing a return for an elderly customer when the agents approached the counter. She noticed immediately the vests marked with ICE and felt a wave of anxiety, not because she had anything to hide, but because as a black woman in America, she had heard too many stories of citizens being mistaken for undocumented immigrants, of people being detained and harassed simply for existing in their own bodies in public spaces. She tried to finish the transaction quickly, hoping the agents were there for some other reason, but Chen stopped directly in front of her register and said loudly enough for multiple customers to hear that they needed to speak with her about her employment. The word choice was deliberate and humiliating, designed to create a public spectacle that would make Aaliyah feel exposed and ashamed. Other customers in the store turned to look. Her manager appeared from his office to see what was happening, and Aaliyah felt her. Face flush with embarrassment, even though she knew she had done nothing wrong. She politely asked the agents to wait until she finished helping her customer, but Chen wasn't interested in politeness or proper procedure. He said this wasn't a request, but a demand, that she needed to come with them now to answer questions about her immigration status and work authorization. The customer Aaliyah had been helping, a white woman with gray hair in her 70s, looked between Aaliyah and the agents with growing confusion. She knew Aaliyah from years of shopping at that store, had chatted with her about families and lives, knew Aaliyah was local to Minneapolis. She told the agents there must surely be some mistake, that Aaliyah had worked there for years and was a lovely girl. But Chen told the woman she needed to back away and let them do their job, the tone making clear that interference wouldn't be tolerated. The woman backed away but immediately pulled out her phone and started. recording, her instincts telling her something was very wrong about this scene. Aaliyah tried to explain there was a misunderstanding, that she was an American citizen born in Minnesota, that her birth certificate and passport were at home if they needed proof. But Chen cut her off, saying they had received information indicating she was a foreign national working without proper authorization. He didn't specify what information they had received or where it came from, because as legal discovery would later reveal, there was no information, no informant tip, no prior investigation, nothing but the agent's assumption that a black woman working behind a store register must be an illegal immigrant who deserved investigation. Aaliyah's manager, a middle-aged white man named David Patterson, who had hired her 3 years earlier and always considered her an excellent employee, approached trying to de-escalate the situation. He told the agents Aaliyah was a long-term employee with all proper documentation on file, that he had personally verified her employment eligibility when she was hired using the standard I-9 form all employers were required to complete. He offered to go get Aaliyah's employment files from his office to prove she was legally entitled to work, but Chen wasn't interested in evidence that would contradict his assumptions. He told David this was a federal matter, and that he should step away if he didn't want to be charged with obstructing a federal investigation. The threat of federal charges silenced David momentarily, though you could see on his face he knew this was wrong, that these agents had no legitimate reason to harass his employee. But, like many people confronted with federal authority, he wasn't certain of his rights or how far he could push back without putting himself at legal risk. So, he stood there helpless as Torres, the second agent, moved behind the checkout counter where Aaliyah stood, effectively invading private employee space, without permission or warrant, and told Aaliyah she needed to come with them to answer more questions. Aaliyah asked if she could call someone, anyone, a lawyer or family member who could help resolve this misunderstanding. The request was perfectly reasonable, the kind of thing any innocent person confronted by law enforcement would ask. But Chen told her there would be no phone calls until she was processed at their facility, a statement that essentially admitted they intended to detain her regardless of any evidence of wrongdoing. Torres was already reaching for handcuffs on his belt, a movement that made multiple customers in the store gasp audibly as they realized these federal agents were actually about to arrest a store cashier at her workplace without any clear explanation of what she had supposedly done wrong. The security cameras captured everything in vivid detail: the expression of fear on Aaliyah's face, the aggressive body language of the agents, customers grabbing their phones to record, David standing helpless several feet away. When Torres reached for Aaliyah's arm to handcuff her, she instinctively pulled back, not aggressively, but reflexively, the way anyone would when confronted with the threat of physical restraint. That normal, human reaction gave the agents the excuse they were looking for to escalate. Chen immediately shouted that she was resisting, that she was obstructing their official duties, allegations completely disproportionate to what the video clearly showed was the instinctive recoil of a frightened woman. Torres grabbed both of Aaliyah's arms and forced her against the checkout counter, while Chen applied the handcuffs, tightening them so firmly they would leave deep marks on her wrists that would be photographed hours later as evidence of excessive force. Aaliyah began crying, not from physical pain, but from the absolute humiliation of being handcuffed like a criminal at her workplace in front of customers and colleagues. The elderly customer who had started recording was now verbally confronting the agents, her voice shaking, with indignation as she demanded to know what crime Aaliyah had committed that justified this treatment. She said she had witnessed the entire interaction and that Aaliyah had done nothing wrong, had not been violent or uncooperative beyond asking to make a phone call. Other customers joined in, expressing shock and anger, some filming on their own phones, others verbally questioning the agent's authority to conduct an arrest on private property without an apparent warrant or probable cause. The scene had transformed into a public spectacle that was rapidly spinning out of the agent's control, but instead of backing down and reconsidering their actions, they doubled down on intimidation and force. Chen turned to the witnesses and said in a loud, authoritative voice that everyone needed to back away, or they too would be detained for interfering with a federal operation. The threat was empty. You can't arrest people for recording law enforcement in a public space or for asking verbal questions, but it worked to silence some of the protests. David, the manager, finally found the courage to speak up again, saying he was calling the store's corporate attorney because he didn't believe the agents had legal right to arrest his employee without a warrant or probable cause. Chen told him that immigration enforcement operations didn't require warrants the same way criminal investigations did, a statement that was only partially true and that completely misrepresented the legal standards for detention. But it sounded authoritative enough to make David hesitate, unsure whether he should continue pushing or simply watch helplessly as his employee was taken away. As the agents began escorting handcuffed Aaliyah toward the store exit, one of her co-workers, a young Hispanic woman named Maria Rodriguez, who worked in the clothing department, ran toward them, asking them to stop. Maria had worked with Aaliyah for 2 years and knew her story, knew about her family in Minneapolis, had even met her mother when she came to visit the store. She told the agents through tears they were making a terrible mistake, that Aaliyah was as American as anyone, and that this was obvious discrimination. Chen told Maria she needed to get back to work, or she would be next to be investigated. A veiled threat that silenced Maria, but was also captured on security cameras as more evidence of the pattern of intimidation the agents used to suppress witnesses. The march through the store toward the exit felt like it lasted forever for Aaliyah. Each step was agony of shame, as shoppers stopped what they were doing to stare, some with pity, others with morbid curiosity, some clearly assuming she must have done something wrong because why else would federal agents be arresting her? The handcuffs cut into her wrists with each movement, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological trauma of being publicly humiliated this way. She kept repeating through sobs that she was an American citizen, that she had a birth certificate, that her parents were born in Minnesota, that this was a terrible mistake. But the agents ignored her completely, treating her declarations of innocence as if they were the expected lies every detained person would tell. They led her through the front sliding doors to where their unmarked vehicle was parked, and it was only as they were about to place her in the back seat that something finally changed the trajectory of this escalating injustice. A local police cruiser pulled into the parking lot, called by one of the store customers who had dialed 911 to report that federal agents were arresting someone who appeared to have done nothing wrong. The officer who stepped out of the car was a black woman in uniform named Sergeant Kenya Williams, a 15-year veteran of the Minneapolis police force with a reputation for being both fair and firm. She immediately assessed the scene with experienced eyes, a crying black woman in handcuffs, 2 ICE agents trying to place her in an unmarked vehicle, multiple witnesses recording and shouting that this was an injustice. Williams approached and asked calmly but authoritatively what was happening, directing her question first to Aaliyah rather than the agents, a deliberate choice that signaled she wasn't automatically assuming the side of federal enforcement. Aaliyah could barely speak through her sobs, but managed to say she was an American citizen, that she had worked at the store for 3 years, that these agents had arrested her for no reason in front of everyone. Williams turned to Chen and Torres and asked to see their documentation, an arrest warrant or deportation order that would authorize them to remove Aaliyah. Chen said they didn't need a warrant because they were conducting an administrative immigration investigation, not a criminal arrest. Williams, who had done her homework on the intersection between local and federal enforcement, responded that even administrative immigration investigations required reasonable suspicion of a violation, and asked what specific evidence they had that Aaliyah was not a citizen or not authorized to work. The question was direct and legally appropriate, forcing the agents to articulate something they clearly couldn't. Torres muttered something about an anonymous tip indicating unauthorized workers were employed at the store, but when Williams asked specifically why that tip had led to Aaliyah rather than any of the other 24 employees in the store, he had no answer. Chen tried to deflect by saying this was a national security matter under federal jurisdiction and that local police had no authority to interfere. But Williams held her ground, explaining she wasn't trying to interfere with legitimate federal enforcement, but had an obligation to ensure the rights of Minneapolis residents were being protected, and that detaining someone without articulable reasonable suspicion violated those rights regardless of which agency was doing the detaining. She suggested the agents should at least allow Aaliyah to provide identification and proof of citizenship before taking her away, a reasonable proposal that should have been the first step from the beginning. Williams's presence and her refusal to simply accept the federal agent's authority without question completely changed the dynamic. The witnesses who had been silenced under Chen's threats became vocal again, emboldened by a police officer. clearly on Aaliyah's side. David ran out of the store with a folder containing Aaliyah's employment documentation, including a copy of her Minnesota birth certificate and driver's license she had provided during the hiring process. Maria had also come outside, carrying Aaliyah's personal bag from her locker that contained her wallet with current identification. Williams examined the documents carefully while Chen and Torres watched with growing frustration. And then she turned to them with an expression that made clear she was not impressed with what they had done. Williams held up Aaliyah's birth certificate, an official document from the state of Minnesota, showing that Aaliyah Marie Johnson had been born at Hennepin County Hospital in Minneapolis on March 15, 1998, and asked the ICE agents if they would care to explain what evidence they had that contradicted this official document. Chen tried to argue that birth certificates could be forged, that they would need to verify authenticity through their own channels. But Williams pointed out they had made no attempt to verify documentation before handcuffing and arresting Aaliyah, that they had jumped straight to detention based on nothing but assumptions about her appearance. She said she was documenting this entire encounter in her own report, and would strongly recommend the agents remove the handcuffs and release Aaliyah immediately unless they could articulate specific legal cause to continue the detention. The implicit threat of local law enforcement oversight and official documentation of the incident clearly worried the agents. They exchanged glances, silent communication between partners who had worked together long enough to read each other. Chen finally said they would need to verify the documentation before releasing Aaliyah, but that they would do so there, rather than taking her to their facility. It was a small but significant victory, an acknowledgement that Williams's presence and this recording witnesses had forced them to back down from their original plan. Torres reluctantly removed the handcuffs from Aaliyah's wrists, revealing deep red marks that Williams immediately photographed with her official phone, creating an evidence record of excessive force that would be crucial later. Chen and Torres took nearly 20 minutes making radio calls and supposedly verifying Aaliyah's birth certificate through their systems, a process Williams watched closely to ensure they weren't fabricating reasons to continue the detention. During that time, more Minneapolis police cruisers arrived, called by Williams, who wanted additional official witnesses to what was clearly becoming a significant incident. The elderly customer who had recorded everything from the beginning approached Williams and offered to provide her footage as evidence, saying she had captured the agents handcuffing Aaliyah without any provocation or real resistance. Multiple other customers also came forward as witnesses, all expressing outrage at what they had witnessed and willing to provide statements documenting that Aaliyah had done nothing to justify her treatment. When the agents finally returned, they reluctantly admitted the birth certificate appeared legitimate and that Aaliyah was indeed an American citizen. There was no apology, no acknowledgement they had just handcuffed and attempted to deport an innocent citizen based on nothing but racial profiling. Chen simply said she was free to go and started to walk away as if the entire interaction was a minor bureaucratic routine that didn't merit further reflection. But Williams stopped them, saying she needed their full names and badge numbers for her official report, and that she would be recommending a formal investigation of this incident through both local and federal channels. The mention of formal investigation made both agents pause, the realization finally dawning that this wasn't just another detention they could bury in paperwork and forget. Aaliyah was shaking as Maria wrapped her in a hug, the trauma of what she had just experienced beginning to hit now that the immediate threat had passed. She looked at the deep marks on her wrists where the handcuffs had cut into her skin, physical evidence of unnecessary force. That still throbbed. David, the manager, approached and told her to take the rest of the day off with pay, that the store would cover anything she needed including counseling if she wanted to talk to someone about the trauma. He also said corporate would have heard about this incident and that they would be supporting her fully if she decided to take legal action. It was small comfort after being publicly humiliated and terrorized, but at least it made clear her employer recognized the injustice of what had happened. Williams pulled Aaliyah aside and gently explained her rights and options. She said Aaliyah should definitely seek to photograph the handcuff marks and any other evidence of injury, seek medical attention if she was experiencing pain, and strongly consider contacting an attorney specializing in civil rights because what the agents had done was a clear violation of her constitutional rights. Williams gave Aaliyah her business card and promised her official report would Document every detail of the incident, including the lack of probable cause for the initial detention, the use of excessive force in the handcuffing, and the agent's failure to verify identification before handcuffing an American citizen. She also mentioned she would personally ensure the store's security footage was preserved and made available for any future investigation or legal proceedings. In the days following the incident, the story exploded in local and then national media. Customer videos showing Aaliyah being handcuffed while crying that she was an American citizen went viral on social media, generating outrage from millions of people who recognized this for what it was: blatant racial profiling by federal agents who assumed a black woman working in a retail store must be an illegal immigrant. Civil rights organizations immediately seized on the case, with the ACLU, NAACP, and multiple immigrant advocacy groups all offering support and resources. Public pressure on ICE respond was intense, especially as investigative journalists began uncovering that Chen and Torres had histories of similar complaints from other individuals who claimed to have been targeted based purely on race. Aaliyah spent those first days in something like shock, repeatedly reliving the trauma of being handcuffed at her workplace, the humiliation of having customers and coworkers witness her arrest, the fear of being taken away by federal agents who refused to listen when she said she was a citizen. She began having panic attacks, especially when she saw any kind of law enforcement vehicle. She couldn't sleep without nightmares about being torn from her life and thrown into a detention center. Her mother, a teacher who had been born and raised in Minnesota, just like Aaliyah, was furious and heartbroken, unable to understand how her daughter, who had never done anything wrong, could be treated like a criminal in her own country. The federal lawsuit was filed 3 weeks after the incident, a comprehensive legal document constructed by a team of top-tier civil rights attorneys who had taken the case pro bono, recognizing its significance. The complaint sued Chen and Torres individually for false arrest, excessive use of force, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violation of civil rights under the 4th and 14th Amendments. It sued ICE as an agency for failure to properly train and supervise its agents, for maintaining policies that allowed and encouraged racial profiling, and for a pattern and practice of detaining American citizens based on nothing but appearance. And it sued the federal government under agency liability theory, arguing the violations weren't the actions of rogue agents, but the result of institutional culture that prioritized detention numbers over constitutional rights. The amount of damages sought was substantial, reflecting not just the trauma Aaliyah had experienced, but also the need to send a message that this behavior would have serious financial consequences. Legal discovery revealed an even more disturbing pattern than anyone had anticipated. Through subpoenas, Aaliyah's team obtained internal records showing the alleged anonymous tip Chen and Torres claimed to have received about unauthorized workers never existed. There was no record of such a tip in their systems, no documentation of any prior investigation of the store. The agents had simply decided on their own that they should investigate that retail location, and GPS records from their official vehicles showed they had been patrolling that shopping area for weeks, watching businesses and presumably profiling workers based on appearance. Internal emails between Chen and his supervisor showed discussions about focusing on high-probability industries, where unauthorized workers were likely to be employed, code language for targeting service businesses with visibly non-white staff. Even more damning, discovery uncovered that both agents had had multiple prior complaints filed against them by citizens who alleged they had been detained without cause based on race. Chen had 9 separate complaints over his 15-year career, including 3 cases where American citizens had been wrongly detained and subsequently released after proving citizenship. Torres had 5 complaints in 8 years. None of these complaints had resulted in meaningful discipline. Most had been marked unfounded or not sustained after internal investigations that consisted of little more than asking the agents for their versions of events. The pattern demonstrated not just that these specific agents were problematic, but that ICE as an institution had systematically and completely failed to hold them accountable or prevent future abuses. The depositions were devastating for the defense. Chen and Torres gave contradictory accounts of what had happened, their stories shifting when confronted with security footage and witness videos that proved their initial claims were false. Chen claimed they had received a specific tip about Aaliyah, but when pressed, couldn't provide any details about when, how, or from whom the tip had come. Torres claimed Aaliyah had been aggressively uncooperative, but video clearly showed her politely asking to make a phone call before being handcuffed. Both agents insisted they had followed proper procedure, but when Aaliyah's attorneys questioned them about what ICE procedure authorized handcuffing an American citizen working in a retail store without first verifying identification, they had no coherent answers. Their depositions read like a case study in how not to answer legal questions under oath. The final settlement was reached 15 months after that traumatic afternoon at the department store, and the terms sent shockwaves through the immigration enforcement community. The monetary compensation to Aaliyah totaled $5.2 million, one of the largest individual settlements for ICE misconduct in United States history. But as with so many of these cases, the money told only part of the story. The settlement included an unprecedented public admission of wrongdoing, with the federal government acknowledging that Aaliyah's detention had violated her constitutional rights, that it had been motivated by racial profiling, and that the agents had used excessive force without legal justification. There was no neither admit nor deny language that typically protected government agencies from full accountability, but a direct statement that what happened to Aaliyah was wrong, illegal, and should never have occurred. Chen and Torres were both terminated from ICE as part of the settlement, their law enforcement certifications permanently revoked to ensure they could never work in federal or local enforcement again. Chen faced federal criminal charges for deprivation of rights under color of law, and eventually accepted a plea deal that resulted in 18 months in federal prison, substantial fines, and 3 years of supervised release after his release. Torres, whose role had been secondary to Chen's, but who had still actively participated in the illegal detention, received a lighter sentence of 6 months in prison and 2 years of probation. The criminal sentences were rare in federal agent misconduct cases, and sent a clear message throughout the enforcement community. You could go to prison for violating citizens' rights, no matter how powerful you thought your agency was. The structural reforms mandated by the settlement were comprehensive and specific. The IECE was required to completely overhaul its policies on detentions in public spaces, making explicit that agents must verify citizenship status before any physical detention, that racial appearance could never be a factor in enforcement decisions, and that claims of anonymous tips had to be documented and verifiable rather than conveniently untraceable. The agency implemented a new mandatory 60-hour training program on racial profiling, constitutional rights of citizens, and de-escalation techniques, developed by outside experts including law professors and civil rights advocates rather than internal instructors who had clearly failed to prevent previous abuses. And crucially, the settlement established an independent review panel with civilian community members who had power to investigate complaints and recommend discipline, removing the oversight process from the hands of the same ICE leadership that had allowed Chen and Torres's behavior to continue unchecked for so long. Aaliyah used a significant portion of her settlement to establish a foundation dedicated to supporting other victims of racial profiling and illegal detention by immigration enforcement. The Johnson Foundation, as it became known, provided free legal representation, mental health support, and financial assistance for citizens and legal residents who had been wrongly targeted by ICE. In its first 4 years of operation, the foundation helped over 200 individuals successfully sue for civil rights violations, resulting in millions of dollars collectively in settlements and, more importantly, forcing policy changes in ICE field offices across the country. Each case built on the precedent Aaliyah's lawsuit established, using the same legal arguments and pointing to the same systemic failures. Aaliyah's case became mandatory study material in federal law enforcement training academies across the country. The security footage showing her detention was used in training sessions as a perfect example of what happens when agents allow bias to guide their actions instead of proper legal procedure. Instructors would pause the video at key moments, when the agents first approached without legal basis, when they handcuffed her without verifying identification, when they threatened witnesses who tried to intervene. Each moment became a lesson about how not to conduct immigration enforcement. Some agents who watched the training came away genuinely impacted, realizing how their own unconscious assumptions could lead them to make the same mistakes. Others remained defensive, seeing the training as an attack on law enforcement rather than a necessary attempt to prevent future rights abuses. Sergeant Kenya Williams, the local police officer who had intervened and effectively saved Aaliyah from being removed in the ICE vehicle, received extensive recognition for her actions. She was promoted to lieutenant and placed in charge of developing training protocol for her department on how local officers should respond when they witnessed federal agents potentially violating someone's rights. Her model of respectful but firm intervention, questioning federal authority without creating unnecessary confrontation while documenting everything for later oversight, became a standard taught in police departments across multiple states. She received awards from civil rights organizations and was invited to speak at conferences about the critical role local enforcement could play in protecting residents' civil rights, even when federal enforcement threatened them. David Patterson, the store manager who had initially hesitated but eventually stood up for Aaliyah, also faced his own reckoning and growth. He spoke publicly about how that experience taught him that sometimes doing the right thing means risking confrontation with authority, that waiting for perfect certainty before standing up for someone means often waiting too long. He worked with the store's corporation to develop new policies protecting employees from harassment by law enforcement, including a commitment to provide legal representation if employees were targeted without cause while working. He also became a vocal advocate for training retail managers on how to respond when federal enforcement showed up on their properties without warrants or clear legal authority. Aaliyah's life had been permanently altered by the incident in ways both harmful and unexpectedly empowering. She never returned to work at that specific department store. The trauma of being handcuffed there made it impossible to enter the building without experiencing panic attacks. She struggled with PTSD for years, requiring extensive therapy and medication to manage anxiety that surfaced whenever she saw any kind of uniformed officer. She had nightmares about being torn from her life and thrown into a detention center, about no one believing she was an American citizen, about disappearing into an immigration system many never escaped. The psychological trauma couldn't be undone by a court settlement, no matter how large. It was a scar she would carry forever, but she had also found purpose in activism and advocacy. She became a powerful public speaker, telling her story at universities, civil rights conferences, and legislative hearings. She was particularly effective because she challenged stereotypes many people held about who was affected by immigration enforcement. She wasn't an immigrant, didn't have a foreign accent, hadn't crossed any borders. She was as American as anyone could be, born in a Minnesota hospital to parents who were also born in Minnesota. And yet, she had been targeted, handcuffed, nearly deported, all because federal agents saw a black woman and assumed she didn't belong. Her story forced people to confront the uncomfortable reality that racial profiling and immigration enforcement wasn't about legal status, but about race. She testified before congressional committees multiple times, pushing for legislation that would increase oversight of ICE operations and make it easier for victims of illegal detention to hold accountable agents who violated their rights. Some of that legislation passed, though often in watered-down forms after political processes. But each hearing, each news article, each public speech raised awareness about a systemic problem many Americans preferred not to acknowledge existed. Her case proved irrefutably that American citizens, particularly American citizens of color, weren't safe from immigration enforcement that operated based on assumptions about who looked American. The elderly customer who had recorded the initial incident, a woman named Margaret Anderson, also became an unlikely activist in her retirement years. She joined civil rights organizations, participated in protests demanding immigration enforcement reform, and used her footage and educational presentations about the importance of witnesses documenting injustice when they saw it. She often said that in her 70 years, she had never thought much about racial profiling or enforcement misconduct, but that witnessing what happened to Aaliyah had opened her eyes to a reality people of color lived with every day. Her activism was a reminder that allies could come from unexpected places, and that sometimes it took witnessing injustice directly to transform awareness into action. Maria Rodriguez, Aaliyah's co-worker, who had run to help her despite Chen's threats, remained a close friend through the following years. She herself had experienced multiple encounters with immigration enforcement despite being an American citizen born in Texas, and seeing what happened to Aaliyah reinforced for her that this wasn't about legal status, but about how agents perceive people based on appearance. She became a volunteer with the Johnson Foundation, using her bilingual skills to help Spanish-speaking families navigate the legal system after their own experiences with racial profiling. 10 years after that afternoon at the department store, Aaliyah reflected on the journey the incident had triggered. The $5.2 million settlement had provided financial security she had never anticipated having, but it came at the cost of trauma that still affected her in unexpected ways. She still sometimes crossed the street to avoid walking past any uniformed officer, still felt her heart race when she saw unmarked vans that resembled enforcement vehicles. But she had also transformed that terrible experience into a force for change. Her foundation had helped hundreds of other victims find justice they might never have achieved on their own. The case had established important legal precedents that made it easier for citizens to sue federal agents for illegal detention. It exposed systemic failures in how IACE trained and supervised its agents, leading to reforms that, while imperfect, at least created more accountability than existed before. It demonstrated that even powerful federal agencies could be forced to admit wrongdoing and pay significant consequences when their actions were properly documented and challenged. And it proved that an ordinary person, a store cashier without political power or special connections, could stand up for her rights and win even against the full weight of the federal government. The security footage from that afternoon remained publicly available, viewed millions of times as a reminder of what racial profiling looks like in action. Each viewing was an opportunity for education, for people to see with their own eyes how federal agents handcuffed an innocent American citizen based on nothing but appearance. The video didn't lie, didn't exaggerate, didn't need interpretation. It simply showed the truth that in 2026, in the United States of America, you could be a citizen born and raised in this country and still be treated like a criminal by government agents because your skin was the wrong color. Chen and Torres, the agents whose actions triggered everything, eventually were released from prison and disappeared into obscurity. Chen reportedly moved to a different state and found work in a field unrelated to law enforcement, his Google search permanently dominated by articles about the case. Torres unsuccessfully tried to challenge the revocation of his enforcement certification, but video evidence was too damning for any review panel to overcome. Neither ever publicly apologized or demonstrated any genuine understanding that their actions had been wrong. For them, apparently, they were victims of a politically correct system that made immigration enforcement impossible. The lack of remorse was a reminder of why systemic changes were so crucial. You couldn't rely on individual agents to develop empathy or conscience. You had to have policies, training, oversight, and accountability that forced compliance with constitutional standards regardless of personal attitudes. Aaliyah's case had contributed to that accountability framework, making it slightly harder for future agents to handcuff innocent citizens without facing real consequences. For Aaliyah, the journey from trauma to action had been long and painful, but also transformative. She had discovered strength she didn't know she possessed, had built a platform for advocacy she had never sought but now used passionately. Her foundation continued growing, her story continued educating, and her impact continued reverberating through a legal system that slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably was being forced to confront its own racism. Aaliyah Johnson's story wasn't about a woman who was handcuffed at a department store. It was about an American citizen who refused to let violation of her rights pass unchallenged, who transformed a moment of terror and humiliation into a movement for justice, and who proved that even against powerful federal agencies, even as an ordinary person without special connections, you could fight back and win. That was the lesson that would echo far beyond her individual case, inspiring others to stand up for their rights, encouraging witnesses to document injustice, and reminding the enforcement system that every citizen, regardless of appearance, had constitutional rights that should be respected. And so, the Tuesday afternoon that began with Aaliyah processing a customer's return and ended with her handcuffed and traumatized became a catalyst for change that helped protect the rights of countless others. The $5.2 million settlement made headlines, But the real legacy was in the policies changed. The agents trained differently, the victims helped, and the message sent that racial profiling by federal enforcement would have real, serious, and expensive consequences.